She was ambitious, independent, and rebuilding her life in America. But on New Year's Eve, 27-year-old Nikita Gadashala vanished after visiting her ex-boyfriend's Maryland apartment. 2 days later, he reported her missing, and police say he left the country the same day. What detectives would later find inside that apartment has now sparked an international manhunt. We're on the case, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Hey, real quick, before we start this episode of On the Case, one of the most watched shows on YouTube, I want to talk about Morgan & Morgan, America's largest personal injury law firm. They're a firm with more than 1,000 attorneys who have recovered $25 billion for more than 500,000 clients. In the past few months alone, a client in Florida received $12 million when insurance offered just $350,000. In Pennsylvania, another client was awarded $26 million, 40 times the insurer's offer. Morgan & Morgan makes it easy to fight for what you deserve. You can even start a claim from your phone. So if you're injured, you can start a claim at forthepeople.com/OTC. You can click the link below or scan the QR code on our screen. Her ex-boyfriend reported her missing, then he fled the country. Now police say that missing person report came as investigators believe that she was already dead, and that her body was later found inside his apartment. This is the international manhunt that's unfolding right now. Police allege that 26-year-old Arjun Sharma stabbed 27-year-old Nikita Gadashala to death in his Maryland apartment on New Year's Eve. Then they claim that he made a calculated move. He called police 2 days later to report her missing, and hours after that call, he was reportedly on a plane to India. Now, Nikita posted on social media a message that is now drawing a lot of attention. It's her final Instagram post. And her caption asks, "Are you scared? Scared? I once crossed the oceans with just 2 suitcases, leaving behind a life and starting a new one all alone." You might look at that and ask yourself, what was she trying to say? And how does a woman who once bravely rebuilt her life end up allegedly murdered by the man who she once lived with, a man who she publicly called respectful just months ago? Now, we're tracking this global chase that started in Maryland. And we're also following this heartbreaking discovery and the mysterious post that hints at a far bigger story. So this is all based on police allegations and court filings. So remember that these are the claims that investigators are making. This story begins on New Year's Eve. According to Howard County detectives, 27-year-old Nikita Gadashala was at her ex-boyfriend's apartment in Columbia, Maryland. Their relationship had ended, but police say it wasn't unusual for them to meet up occasionally. Then, shortly after 7 o'clock that night, detectives believe the unthinkable happened inside that apartment unit on Twin Rivers Road. They allege that Nikita's ex, 26-year-old Arjun Sharma, stabbed her to death. For the next 48 hours, there was deafening silence. Nikita, a woman described by friends as vibrant and diligent, suddenly stopped all communication. She didn't answer text messages or phone calls. Her social media, usually active, went completely dark. Her friends grew increasingly terrified, and they began flooding online groups with posts, desperately asking for anyone if they had seen her. The friends were so afraid that something bad could have happened that some actually filed their own missing person reports, pleading with authorities to find her. Then, on Friday, January 2nd, a call came in that seemed on the surface to confirm everyone's worst fears. The person reporting Nikita Gadashala missing was Arjun Sharma himself. And according to police reports, he told officers that he last saw his ex-girlfriend at his apartment on December 31st and that she had disappeared. Police say that on the very same day, hours after he allegedly made that missing person report, Arjun Sharma went to Dulles International Airport and he got on a flight and left the United States. His destination, authorities confirmed, was India, the other half of the world. Now, with the person who last reported seeing Nikita now gone, the investigation accelerated. The following day, Saturday, January 3rd, detectives executed a search warrant for Arjun Sharma's apartment. What they found inside is at the heart of this tragedy, because there in his apartment, they discovered the body of Nikita Gadashala. Police reported that she had suffered multiple stab wounds. She was pronounced dead at the scene. By Sunday, even though their suspect was overseas, Howard County Police secured an arrest warrant for Arjun Sharma, charging him with first and second degree murder in Nikita Gadashala's death. The local police department is now working with federal agencies and Interpol, trying to navigate the complex process of an international extradition to bring him back to the United States to face charges. So before we talk a little bit more about that part of the investigation, I want to talk a little bit more about who Nikita Gadashala was beyond the tragic headline that now carries her name. In the days and weeks before her death, she left glimpses of her life online, posts that now read with a haunting, almost prophetic weight. Her final message to the world was a puzzle. On Instagram, she shared a note and it read, "Are you scared? Scared? I once crossed the oceans with just 2 suitcases, leaving behind a life and starting a new one all alone. Almost failed, rebuilt it all over again." Just months earlier, in a more mundane but revealing post, Nikita had turned to a Facebook group in August looking for someone to take over her old room. The room was in the same Columbia apartment where her life would allegedly come to an end. And in that post, she described her then ex-boyfriend, Arjun Sharma, in practical, even positive terms for a potential roommate. She reportedly wrote that he was, quote, respectful and kept the place clean, an ordinary detail that now does sit in jarring contrast to the allegations that he is facing. Join us now to talk more about this investigation, some of the unique angles to it, is Safa Robinson Ferrer, criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor. It's always great to have you on Law and Crime. In this case, the person who is now accused of murder is the person who called in. Yes, he also, we can talk about him allegedly fleeing to India, but he's also the person that called in a missing persons report. Just what stands out to you about that part? And just, it seems calculated in the way that the phone call was made and suddenly he's on a plane.
It's very calculated, and that to me speaks to what we call consciousness of guilt. You know, he's trying to do things that would ultimately throw off law enforcement from his trail of him being the perpetrator of this crime. And so we've got those things in play, and also not only that, we have that he ultimately fled. And at least the information that we got in was that he planned this missing person's phone call, but ultimately went straight to the airport very shortly thereafter, leaving the country, of course, evading law enforcement or their apprehension of him once they would have had enough information to make him a suspect.
I know police get a lot of missing persons calls, and a lot of times it's someone who's run away, and this was after New Year's, and I'm sure they get missing persons calls that people just, you know, there's so many that we don't hear about. But in this case, she's called in as a missing person, and then if police were to follow up on this, the guy's already out of the country, where that seems like it would have been a red flag. What do you make of the fact that he calls it in, but then also he's able to leave? You know, police didn't follow up, it seems, and not a criticism of police. I know they got a lot going on, but the person who called it in is suddenly out of the country. That just seems a bit suspicious.
It's a huge red flag. And, you know, we don't know the exact timing of these things. You know, I know, or at least the information was conveyed that he made this missing person phone call, but then ultimately fled shortly thereafter, maybe within the day of him making that phone call. However, you know, the thing is, when you get a missing person report to law enforcement, there's a ton of missing persons reports, right? And so how long it takes for an officer to respond or for an investigator to be assigned and to gather enough information to make a determination that this person is either in danger or we're going to hold on until, you know, maybe 24 hours to 48 hours. There's a lot of things that factor into this case. So what really stands out to me is how they ultimately were able to make the determination that they were going to get a search warrant to search his apartment and ultimately found her body located there, and what information they had that provided the basis for that warrant.
Because it's easy for us on the outside to say, well, just go in the apartment, like, you know, like knock on the door and go in, like you're going to find everything. What would they actually need to have, even if she's missing, that was known as a place where she was or had spent time? I mean, really, what do you need to bring to a judge for them to say, yes, you can walk into this apartment, he's not there, but you can see if there's any evidence that you need.
What the investigators would do is gather enough evidence that would elevate to probable cause to believe that a crime has occurred, and that there is some sort of evidence of that crime in this apartment or in this location. They draft an affidavit reflecting those things to the judge, articulating that probable cause, get a judge to sign it based off of the affidavit, and sometimes they will attach certain exhibits or pieces of evidence that will highlight to the judge, this is why this is important, this is why we've met our threshold, and we need this warrant. And so the judge will usually sign off on that warrant to go to that property or location to search particular areas or the whole thing and find what they're looking for. That is what we call it's a warrant requirement. There are exceptions to that warrant requirement. One of the exceptions being if there's an exigent circumstance. At this point in time, doesn't seem that it was here or present. We don't know ultimately at what point in time she was deceased.
When it comes to like what we do now, because we know that here in the United States, there's an arrest warrant out to get this suspect, but he has taken, according to law enforcement, a flight halfway across the world. He's in India. The Indian government says that they're going to help find him, but what more can be done here in the United States? As if you're a detective in this county in Maryland, you have this murder that needs to be solved, but you're almost at the will of the Indian government, maybe Interpol, the FBI, to really do a lot of the work to find him in a foreign country.
And that's what local government is going to have to lean in on as their federal partners to be able to work and get this apprehension of this individual. And it does seem that the Indian government is at least being supportive and cooperative with U.S. officials to get that accomplished. And so their policing strategies and their abilities to locate this individual will be deployed. And there will just be simple communication and conversations between the two governments to get this individual apprehended and brought back to the United States. Now, we don't know how up to date their technology is and things of that nature. Certainly, if that person was in the U.S., it's probably a better likelihood or a higher chance that they will be apprehended. India, I'm not so sure of how well their apprehension and technology is, but I would assume that it's right in line with ours and that they'd be cooperative and get them into custody.
This show's not about geopolitics, but India is typically seen as an ally of the United States. What's the relationship like with a country like that when it comes to, once they are able to find him, if and when that happens, getting him back to the United States to face charges?
It makes extradition traditionally easier. You don't have to jump through so many loopholes and dealing with governments that are not cooperative. So I do think that it generally makes it easier. Now, I have not had a client apprehended in the country of India, but I generally speaking, it does make it easier. So even if we're in New York, we have Canada, it makes it a little bit easier to transport these individuals and extradite them when the governments are at least on good terms or talking terms.
Well, because this is kind of like a side question of that, because I feel like there's always at least you see it in the movies, but it's the person who's trying to make it to Mexico because they've committed a crime and they're trying to disappear. Typically, even when you cross international borders, that doesn't suddenly, it's not like this, I'm over the line and I'm scot-free. I mean, certainly not in Canada, and even Mexico for that matter, we've seen people brought back over. But when someone commits a crime, especially one as serious as murder here in the United States, does any sort of escaping to a place like India actually help you if you are trying to get away?
I believe there are countries that do not extradite back to the United States. What those countries are right now, I don't know off the top of my head, but I think there are three. And so I think one of them is a European country. But so traditionally speaking, it's up to the U.S. to come and find them if that foreign country's laws even allow for that. So there are, I believe, a few countries that do not extradite, but generally speaking, a lot of them do.
From a defense point of view, if and when he is arrested, I mean, this is a guy who, according to law enforcement, there is a body in his room of someone he knows who he once dated who had been stabbed to death. From the peanut gallery, that feels like an open and shut case in a lot of ways. I mean, what's the defense strategy potentially once he gets back?
There's quite a few things. So they first have to prove that this individual is the person who is alleged to have committed this act. They have to prove his identity and that he was in fact the perpetrator. I don't know that there's going to be any evidence that indicates that directly that he was the one that had done this. You know, somebody saying, I saw him do X, Y, and Z. Now, there's certainly circumstantial evidence of that, but there's no direct evidence. So that's one thing that will be challenged. The other thing is we do have to deal with this phone call. He was the person that called 911. And so, yes, it may have been a red flag or a red herring to throw law enforcement off. A defense attorney is going to say or exploit, why did he call 911 and report her missing when he could have just easily left the country without even calling and reporting her missing? He already had plans to do that. So why add the phone call to it? So that could raise some sort of question as to whether or not, you know, he was the individual that actually committed this act. So that will be something else that gets challenged. And then we also have the fact that she was located in his apartment, which is not great for the defense. But do we know who else has access to that apartment? That will have to be explored. Did she have any issues with anybody else? And there's a number of things that can be challenged. The individual's mental state. There's a lot of layers to it. Now, more often than not, when you see domestic incidents such as this, it is often true that it is that person's partner who has committed that act. So that's generally known, and that's why law enforcement will traditionally target their investigation to the partner initially. That could have been the case here, and once they began that investigation, ultimately had enough information to believe that he was the one that murdered her in his apartment. And not only that, it's an apartment building. So did anybody hear anything? Did anybody see anything? Is there ring camera footage? You know, is there a neighbor that might have heard some yelling or screaming or indications of an altercation? All of those things are going to factor in.
When it comes to the flight and leaving, because I could see, I mean, that will be, if and when this goes to trial, the defense attorney is going to have to handle that, because if you're a prosecutor, you're going to be like, this guy, you know, they will lay out this, what they will say is a calculated, she was murdered, he calls it in, but the flight was already booked and then he's out the door. I could see a defense attorney say, like, well, this flight was already planned, he has family over there, he's got to go. How risky can that be, though? And we don't know who's on this jury, if and whether there is a jury, because I could see a lot of jurors. Maybe if I was a juror, I'd be like, yeah, okay. You know, that it, like, you know, like I could see a juror sitting there and being like, there's no way that you suddenly just booked a trip to Italy or to India, and maybe he did book it earlier. I don't know, but let's just assume that it was kind of, okay, this happens, booking the trip, calling police, and then I'm out the door as police say happen. It feels like that would be really difficult to get a lot of jurors to buy into that.
Absolutely. And the great thing about that, though, is that I'm sure at some point in time there will be somebody that deals with either forensics, and it doesn't even have to be as in-depth as a forensic expert, to see what time that ticket was purchased. If it was purchased online, it was a credit card transaction, they're going to be able to narrow down the date that it was purchased. They may be able to narrow down the time it was purchased and relate that in time with the time of the missing person call and the discovery of the body. So that should answer a lot of questions. But I think most people will hear that and think consciousness of guilt. Defense attorney, of course, is going to say, my client had family over there, he had already planned on going, or he was scared. And he knows that more often than not, the partner is blamed and he was scared. Did it make it right for him to run? No, but he did, and he was scared. Doesn't mean because he fled that he was the perpetrator of this crime.
You know, this is, it does appear to be a very sad case of domestic violence, of partner violence. As somebody who's prosecuted some of these cases, how often do you need to have, you know, because there will be, I assume, a lot of evidence forensically, especially because it was a stabbing, and you know, not to be morbid, but that, you know, it seems like there'd be a lot of evidence there. But in those type of cases, do you need a motive? How important is the motive part of it? That maybe they were having some sort of issue, he was controlling, you know, not saying that that's in this case, but we do hear that from time to time. I mean, how important is the motive in prosecuting cases like this?
Motive always helps. It always helps to show why that person committed the act or is alleged to have committed that act. You don't need to prove motive, but it certainly helps with putting forth the story or the timeline. You know, so it's easy to say, well, this person was murdered because they cheated on their partner and it was a crime of passion and this happened. Or maybe something else along the line. So it's good to be able to explain away the motive. When there's not a motive, sometimes jurors will say, well, I get it, but why would he do that? So it's always easier when you do have a motive and you can state that clearly to the jury.
And when it comes to figuring out the dynamics of a relationship that on the surface seemed very normal, very typical, like even they had broken up and she had talked about him being respectful, and then suddenly this happens, and if he's actually guilty of this, as a prosecutor, how do you go about investigating what his background is, what was going through his life, what the dynamics of the relationship were?
Yeah, so in those aspects, you talk to people. You're going to talk to the victim's friends, family members who may have known about the relationship, known about her and the type of person that she was, which I think the reference was, she was a very smart young woman who enjoyed family, friends, things like that. Netflix and chill kind of situation, I think, was according to her profile.
Mm-hmm.
And so you really get to know who she is as a victim and as a person. And through getting to know her, you may also get to know him. So they may start to explore who are his associates, his family, his friends. Who can they start to ask questions? What was he like? What was his childhood like? If he has any criminal history, they will be able to pull that up and see, what other crimes he may have been convicted of in the past, or if he's had any mental health commitments in the past. All of those things the law enforcement will be able to explore to really piece together what type of individual this was. Not only that, social media helps a lot. A lot of times if people are on social media, and I don't know if that's the case for this individual, but they tell on themselves and they tell who they are through their social media posts and things like that. And also checking their internet history. If there's, the ability to, get a warrant to get into the computers or any phones that may have been left, that will tell the story of who this person is.
Well, I also think, kind of going back to the FBI part of it, because this is, not a tiny county in Maryland, but, if you're building this case and he has a lot of friends and family and she has friends and family in India as well, and as you're building this case up and you need to communicate with people on the other side of the world, how difficult, obviously there's Zoom, there's ways to communicate with them, but being on the ground, actually finding the people that know them, speaking to them face to face, how do you go about kind of coordinating with a prosecutor's office in India or a police department in India in trying to get a picture of who they are when you are not the FBI or Interpol and you are going to be, you're just a sheriff's office or a district attorney in Maryland?
It can certainly be difficult, but I think that some of these communities have been diversified enough where it would be easy for the prosecutor to maybe get an interpreter that speaks the same language who is able to communicate with that side of the world. And, when you're in law enforcement or prosecutors, sometimes you're working 24 hours, you're working at night. And so just setting up the time to be able to have that communication and conversation with those interpreters and with law enforcement as well. English has, generally speaking, been the universal language of business and, worldly transactions. And so there's a good chance that law enforcement in India also does speak English. And also, again, leaning into those federal partners who may be well-versed in other languages that would be relevant to this case.
And we'll see what happens next. Just a very sad way this happening around New Year's in Maryland. Safa Robinson-Ferrer, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor. It's always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, as always.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.